Welcome to the 2020 National Union of Journalists Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture, organised by the Black Members Council of that union. It's been recorded in extremely troubling, extraordinary times. We're facing a global pandemic that's caused more than 1 million deaths and ruined lives, including those of journalists and other media workers. But let's not forget that the racism pandemic has killed many more Black people over the centuries than COVID-19. Fearless campaigning journalist, the Black female Claudia Jones, who we are celebrating now, fought all her life against racism, and it was a short life, tragically. Our guest speaker, with no live physical audience because of the pandemic, is rising academic star, Dr. Francesca Sobande. I'm proud to say she's the third woman to be showcased since I became Black Members Council Chair 3 years ago. Francesca is a digital media studies lecturer at Cardiff University in Wales, where she's also director of the BA Media, Journalism and Culture programme. Francesca is going to talk about Black women's digital media and activist experiences in Britain. Francesca.
Thank you very much for welcoming me today and for such a generous introduction as well. I'm going to hopefully now share some slides whilst talking through the topic today, which relates to Black women's media, digital and activist experiences in Britain. So if technology is on our side, in about a moment's time, you should be able to see some slides on your own screen. And I just want to reiterate what's already been said in terms of the incredibly challenging times we are living in right now, and how moments of connection and coming together and collectiveness feel even more important than perhaps they've ever felt before. So I'm going to share these slides and start to go through them now. I just wanted to start again by thanking Mark, Natasha, and everybody who's been involved in the NUJ and who have kindly invited me to deliver this Claudia Jones Memorial Lecture this year. It's an honour to speak at this event, and I hope that despite the different format of it than in previous years, you'll find what I have to say and share to be useful in some way. Some of the research that I'll be reflecting on is based on over 5 years of work that I've been doing focused on the digital lives of Black women in Britain, and some of which is covered in my recent book of the same title, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan this summer. So the context of 2020 and thinking about digitally mediated crises and also forms of solidarity. 2020 has been an incredibly challenging year for many people, and one that is marked by different crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing anti-Blackness, racism and police brutality that is impacted by Black people around the world. When preparing for this talk, I found myself thinking about the central role of digital media in many contemporary forms of communication and the creation of vital transnational forms of solidarity, particularly among Black people across different countries and different continents as well. So right now, much mainstream media in Britain and elsewhere is ultimately failing to pay sustained and careful attention to the atrocities that are occurring in Nigeria and how they are shaped by colonialism. However, with the use of digital tools and social media, protesters on the ground there, particularly Black feminists, are keeping Black African diasporic people around the world informed of what is happening and how to support grassroots organisers in Nigeria. Digital technology is being used by Black women across the globe as part of liberationist struggles against multiple forms of intersecting oppression, including the effects of colonialism, imperialism, racial capitalism, anti-Blackness, sexism, misogyny, and ableism. So whether it is with the use of hashtags on Twitter or by sharing video recorded footage on platforms such as Instagram, Black women are harnessing the powers of new media as part of activism which is not solely dependent on digital technology, but can sometimes be strengthened by it. How does all of this relate to the incredible work and legacy of Claudia Jones, who in the poignant words of Carol Boyce Davies, was a Black woman and a communist, clear about her ideological orientation, as she was about her identity as a Black woman writing and doing political work simultaneously? To me, and as I will go on to discuss, some connections between the insights and activism of Claudia Jones and Black women's contemporary experiences of collective organising and consciousness raising are very apparent. The activism and writing of Claudia Jones, which were interdependent, involved the pursuit of social change through the dismantling of structural oppression. Further still, the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist politics of Jones involved critique of media production and representation systems. And such critiques are just as applicable today as they were when they were first articulated by Jones. In the brilliant book, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, Carol Boyce Davies refers to Jones as being ahead of her time when commenting on the astute observations of Jones in relation to how the media pushes oppressive depictions and discourse concerning Black women and their experiences. Reflecting on the state of media earlier on in the 21st century, Boyce Davies states, "Today, as corporate journalism, embedded reporters, and mass media control via television have become the dominant modes of communication, the absence of more radical media is noticeable." As Boyce Davies asserts, media, markets, and communications of various sorts produce a multiplicity of possibilities. At the same time, they continue to exact a toll on those left out or exploited by these same processes. And really for me, it was through thinking about the extensive work of Claudia Jones, as well as the vivid writing and research of Boyce Davies about Jones and media power dynamics, that I found myself reflecting on media developments in recent decades and how these are implicated in the lives and activism of Black women in Britain. So with this in mind, I will now be speaking a bit about some of my own research on the media experiences of Black women in Britain, while considering how these different experiences relate to the extraordinary efforts of Claudia Jones. Many on-screen portrayals of Black women on television in Britain have involved images that objectify, hypersexualize, and spectacularize Black women in derogatory ways that deny the many different realities of Black women's experiences. Media depictions of Black women in Britain are also very much impacted by colorism, which is why when Black women are represented, it is often light-skinned Black women who appear, and who are depicted in ways that reflect a societal idealization of whiteness and lightness, and the pervasiveness of colorist forms of anti-Blackness that are specifically directed at dark-skinned Black people. Yeah. Black women's media representation is also shaped by the dominance of heteronormative narratives concerning heterosexual romance, marriage, and idealized family life, resulting in the hypervisibility of on-screen depictions of heterosexual Black women in comparison to the lack of depictions of lesbian, bisexual, and queer Black women. The nuanced experiences of Black women in Britain are often overlooked or reduced to representations emptied of substance as part of dominant discourse pertaining to the media, the creative and culture industries, inequality, and public life and politics. Nevertheless, some of the experiences of Black women in Britain have been the focus of critical events and dialogue over the years, and very, very important activism, including activities that were yielded by the work of Claudia Jones. So when reflecting on the construction and circulation of stereotypical depictions of Black women in the media, I think it's important for us to always recognize that media representations don't emerge out of nowhere. Rather, media depictions are located in particular places and moments in time, and they can communicate much about social and political histories, as well as contemporary structural inequalities. Instead of just thinking about specific images and stereotypes, I think that it can often be more useful to speak about how depictions of Black women in the media are commonly used and framed in ways that serve to uphold oppressive ideas, narratives, and actions that are harmful to Black women. So it's not just about how Black women are depicted, it's also about who or what is behind such depictions, the politics surrounding the production process, and connected work and labor conditions, as well as the messages and meanings that are intended to be associated with these images, and the ways that these do or don't contribute to improving the lives of all Black women, and not just a select few. Relatedly, the work of Claudia Jones was grounded in a Black Marxist and anti-imperialist position, which foregrounds the importance of considering not only how Black people are depicted in media and political spheres in society, but more significantly, the material conditions and systemic forms of oppression that such depictions or experiences of working in these spaces connect to. At times, representations in the media are nothing more than shallow, surface level, and tokenistic in their makeup, devoid of any connection to substantial social change or political commitments and liberationist goals. Even so, from literary settings to the small screens of mobile devices, representations of Black women continue to be constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed by them in meaningful ways that are worthy of acknowledging and understanding. Ione Benjamin provides a detailed account of the Black press in Britain in a book of the same name that focuses on pre-21st century and charts the creation and popularity of newspapers and magazines, such as the West Indian World, Voice, Black Beat International, Pride Magazine, and the Caribbean Times. In doing so, Benjamin sheds light on the significance of Black newspapers and magazines, as well as many different ways that Black people have created media. Although contemporary Black press and publishing activity in Britain is often treated by predominantly white mainstream media organisations and publishing industry sector activity as though it is relatively recent and emergent in nature, as is outlined in Benjamin's brilliant and crucial work, forms of Black press and publishing have existed in Britain for a very long time. The legacy of Black press and publishing in Britain has played a central part in Black creative, cultural, political, and activist work, and has contributed to how Africans in the diaspora communicate with each other and forge cross-continental connections. As Benjamin perfectly puts it, the emergence of the Black press in Britain grew out of the demand for a representative voice, a voice that redresses the balance of the discriminatory mainstream media, one that addresses the social, cultural, and political issues pertaining to their communities, which in turn helps to correct the imbalance both in the media and across the political and social spectrum, and which counters negative stereotype stories propagated by some mainstream news organs. Among the many Black press contributions of Black women that Benjamin discusses is the creation of the West Indian Gazette, launched in 1958 by political activist Claudia Jones a year after Ghana gained its independence. When exploring resources at the Black Cultural Archives, I came across other essential accounts of Black women's media and activist experiences in the past, and which inform what we see now in the present. The Black Women in Media Conference that took place in London in 1984 is one of many events that exemplifies how, for a long time, Black women have actively addressed issues concerning intersecting equalities and the media in Britain. Second wave feminist magazine Spare Rib in 1984 describes the Black Women in Media Conference as having involved workshops to discuss topics such as Black women's access to the media's role in perpetuating racism and sexism, a Black women's media network, access to the media and sharing skills, training courses and control of images presented of Black women in the media, and how both the feminist media and Black media could be more accountable to Black women's needs and issues. In the years since then, digital developments have resulted in some shifts in terms of how Black women in Britain create and engage with the media, as well as participating in activism that extends beyond the boundaries of the country that they're in. Since my research commenced in 2015, I've spent time interviewing Black women in Britain about their media experiences, as well as analysing material accessed at the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, London, and through the Spare Rib Digital Archive as well. Findings stemming from this work highlight how for decades, Black women in Britain have strived to change oppressive media activity, while also documenting their own lives and representing themselves in ways that involve creating new publications and alternative media material. Examples include Media Diversified, Black Ballads, and Galden. From zine making to creating independent publishing houses, throughout history, Black women have found routes that enable them to autonomously communicate their perspectives and share their creative and campaigning work. Those I interviewed spoke of their efforts to avoid specific media outlets, which they identified as often communicating stereotypical ideas and images of Black women, which promote anti-Black and sexist ideologies that are connected to what may be referred to as a white imaginary and white mainstream media, oftentimes bolstered by heteronormative and patriarchal positions. Such perspectives connect to the inimitable words of writer, editor, scholar, and so much more, Toni Morrison, who said, "Far from our original expectations of increased intimacy and broader knowledge, routine media representations or routine media presentations deploy images and language that narrow our view of what humans look like or ought to look like, and what in fact we are like." For some Black women in Britain, their rejection of various mainstream media channels forms part of a wider and strategic attempt to create and source media depictions of, by, and benefiting Black women, outside of the claustrophobic and capitalist confines of mainstream mass media in Britain. In the case of one woman who I interviewed, the prospect of facing forms of harassment and abuse from the public, as well as institutional oppression within the industry, meant that she chose to turn down a significant media opportunity despite her aspirations to pursue a career in this area. Her decision to turn down the opportunity reflects the futility of so-called media industry diversity initiatives, which are marketed as enabling Black people's entry into careers in the industry, but which fail to address forms of oppression that Black people encounter within the organisations themselves and fail to identify institutional measures to support such individuals in the likely event that their hypervisibility in the media leads to abuse from the public, including anti-Black, xenophobic, sexist, misogynistic, and Islamophobic abuse, which is also impacted by colorism. The collective, creative, and cultural pursuits of Black women in Britain, especially Black women from working class backgrounds, have often lacked substantial funding. Hence, decades of self-publishing, self-representing, and community organising among Black women in Britain, which is now influenced by online content creation that can enable the expression of political and social issues in dialogic and powerful ways, challenging the dominance of discussions led by traditional news outlets and gatekeepers. The rise of social media and online content sharing platforms in recent decades has generated publishing avenues that are often deemed to be more democratic than traditional press and print pathways. More specifically, the rich history of Black feminist media production and publishing has led to present-day digital forms of do-it-yourself, DIY, or do-it-together, DIT publishing, including the proliferation of first-person online essays and video vlogs. However, tensions exist between the potential for Black women's independent forms of writing, media, and culture production to form part of anti-capitalist activist projects, and the possibility of such work being commodified and co-opted by predominantly white commercial institutions in search of profitable content and commentaries. In the words of one woman who I interviewed, there's a need to have Black people on the ground doing things. I'm seeing lots of Black men doing incredible things in film. There are lots of things happening. It feels like a movement, like things are finally moving. But for women, it's really slow. For content creators, I feel like because things are really slow, I just think it's very DIY. Like, I hate the term millennial, but I think we're in this time when we don't want to wait anymore. People are just making their own spaces. It's very DIY with our iPhones, making our own iconography and making our own content. It's really important that we carve out our own narratives and that we don't shy away from creating spaces for ourselves. So in discussing Black DIY digital culture in Britain, the same person recognised that due to anti-Blackness, Black men can of course struggle in the media industry, but that it's the interlocking impact of anti-Black racism, sexism, misogyny, and other forms of oppression that results in the specifics of inequality faced by Black women. Although it's often glibly claimed that nowadays anybody can be a media producer or a content creator, factors to do with oppression really impact whose creation of media, whose production of culture and content is most likely to be regarded as creative, skillful, and a form of paid work, and whose tends to be societally trivialized, devalued, and dismissed. As has been raised by Black women and Black feminist writers, activists, creatives, cultural commentators, critics, and scholars, Black women have been misrepresented and maligned in media, visual culture, and public life for centuries. Their image and labor has also frequently been exploited in the service of capitalism and its patriarchal, racist, sexist, colonialist, and ableist underpinnings. In contrast, Black women around the world produce and share media content as part of resistant and activist work, which challenges the structural conditions that diminish their quality of life, as well as the lives of others. Among examples of this is the use of hashtags and social media to raise awareness of the police brutality, violence, and oppression that is aimed at Black women, including interlocking transphobia, cis-sexism, misogyny, and anti-Black racism that Black trans women face, all of which is commonly underreported and misrepresented in mainstream mass media. The growth of social media platforms and independent media, where audiences can broadcast their critique of racist caricatures and media stereotypes to the detriment of the success of some shows and the content that's featured in it, has been impactful in terms of strengthening the potentially powerful impact of online critique, of criticism and backlash. So this move away from the one-to-many broadcast model that was more common in previous decades, this move towards this many-to-many communication approach means that when people are annoyed, they're frustrated, they are disgruntled about the different ways that they see stereotypical depictions circulating, it might be by going online that they can actually do something about that and put pressure on the people behind those images. Moreover, social media can contribute to the nationally and globally effective work of grassroots organisers and trade union organisations like NUJ's Black Members Council. That said, Black women's experiences of social media can involve dealing with intense forms of harassment and abuse, as well as navigating the potential of censorship, in the words of one woman who I spoke to. So there can be a spectacularization and superficiality. There can be bullying. This person said, "This social media is not a decolonized space. It's not a safe space. I think the thing that comes into my head is that I'm no longer on Facebook, but from what I understand, these platforms can censor people speaking their truths about racism. That often, if you talk about whiteness, there seems to be algorithms that seem to shut that conversation down. I find that talking about decolonial processes, talking about racism in a language that they do not deem as acceptable, means that you're shut down from having the conversation." So this person went on to speak about how they see different racists online being emboldened, being able to post comments that are incredibly offensive and are very explicitly racist, but the censorship that they experience seems to very much differ to the censorship of those calling out that racism. So in the absence of an interested publisher or support from mainstream media or creative and cultural industry organizations, which often exclude Black people from decision-making processes, Black women have been blogging and more recently vlogging, including as part of their activist and Black feminist work. Since the launch of video sharing platform YouTube in 2005, which provides people with opportunities to upload and share videos to a global audience, vlogging culture has moved from the margins of mainstream media to the center in some cases. Undoubtedly, the notion that vlogging constitutes a form of publishing and activism may be a source of contention and disagreement. Nevertheless, vlogs can be a platform for Black feminist and activist work, and a part of also inherently capitalist and individualistic aspects of vlogger and consumer culture, which contrasts with Black feminist and anti-capitalist positions. So for some Black women, their use of YouTube and production of vlogs about their thoughts and lives might be nothing more than a source of leisure pastime, which feels detached from political motivation or an intention to yield financial profit. But for others, their engagement with or creation of vlogs can be connected to liberationist politics, rooted in some of the same principles at the core of the work of Claudia Jones and all that went on with the West Indian Gazette. So we're seeing examples of people making use of digital media with an intention to dismantle power relations and possibly redistribute knowledge and resources. In 2017, I argued that YouTube can be used as part of resistant efforts that Black women are leading. But whilst I maintain this point, in the years since then, I've become much more aware and critical of how the video sharing platform is a hotbed of radicalizing far-right and white supremacist content. For these reasons, I avoid simplistically asserting that YouTube and vlogger culture is an integral part of Black women's contemporary activism and media production. Instead, I try to tarry with how, at times, this may be so, but due to how YouTube and vlogger culture are ultimately connected to white supremacist capitalist patriarchy in many ways, we must understand these spaces as also being a source of the sustained structural oppression of Black women. The economics and governance of platforms such as YouTube, which are known sites of rife white supremacist content, constrain the potential for their use to contribute to Black women's and feminist liberationist efforts, without substantially exposing them to considerable harm. So by now, you've been looking at this slide and hopefully thinking a little bit about my concluding thoughts and the process that has brought me to this point. I'm aware that many forms of exploitation and oppression lurk beneath the surface of digital spaces, even those that promise to prioritize liberatory goals over profit. The comments of many Black women who I interviewed about their media and digital experiences suggest that online environments can be a source of Black women's resistance, as well as leaving their digital commentary exposed to corporate cooptation and types of commodification which contrast with the intentions of the person who produced that media in the first place. Black people around the world use digital technology and social media in ways that involve connecting and communicating with each other and communities that they are a part of. Resulting digital discourse is sometimes susceptible to being repackaged in ways that serve others' commercial interests and may even endanger the lives of those behind the original content that becomes represented by others. A concern expressed by some who I interviewed was that public discussions that they have on social media may be used and mined by different individuals and institutions in search of material for article pitches and content that connects to Black cultural references, but without actually involving or crediting Black people, especially Black women. So often faced with the prospect of potentially having to compromise their politics to try and secure the support of mainstream media and publishing industry organizations, Black women and feminist writers and creators in Britain and globally have a long legacy of producing their own publishing and media production pathways. Their independent and collective work, writing, culture production, and archiving efforts continue to involve much analog activity, but can also be propelled by different digital spaces and technology that might be used to co-create and share Black feminist knowledge and forge transnational solidarities, which we're seeing so many examples of right now. Denying the role of digital tools and the internet in certain components of contemporary Black feminist media and publishing is misguided, but so too is an uncritical and celebratory claim of the so-called democratizing and radical potential of DIY content sharing platforms that might be perceived as playing a pivotal role in the Black activism of some. It remains important to acknowledge that the impact of digital developments and social media in the lives of Black women and their media experiences has in some cases had a phenomenal effect in terms of reaching global audiences, making connections with people in different parts of the world. But we can oftentimes speak about digital experiences without making connections to offline realities, which is why for me, this conversation today is a chance for me to recognize the different ways that digital media is a part of Black women's creativity, is a part of Black women's activism and lives. But we need to have these discussions in a way that never involves us overlooking related offline material conditions and forms of structural oppression, which definitely do not disappear in digital spaces. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you taking a moment to engage with what I had to say, and I hope that it was helpful in some way. Thanks again.
Thanks, Francesca, for that thoroughly engaging, thought-provoking lecture that is a fitting tribute to Claudia Jones. I hope you won't mind me asking you a few questions. You've robustly exposed the challenges facing Black women in the media, particularly in the digital sphere. What are some of the solutions?
Yes, that's a big question with probably lots of different answers and that could come up. I think for me, at the very least, something that I would like to see more of in the future is different digital spaces or different digital technologies being designed in a way that involves Black people, first of all, and not only involves Black people, but involves a politics that is rooted in tackling forms of oppression. So oftentimes we see the way that social media sites work, the way that tech operates, there's a focus on profit rather than people. And in the future, in order for Black women and Black people and everybody to have a better experience in digital spaces, I feel as though there needs to be a much clearer intention whereby things are designed with the view to addressing inequalities rather than waiting to see how those inequalities continue to surface once the technology or the digital space is up and running.
You talked about gatekeepers, and predominantly they're white, heterosexual, middle class, able-bodied men who seem to handpick acceptable Black voices who are allowed into national newspaper and broadcasting spaces. How can we as Black people challenge that, particularly media workers?
I think in some ways, for me, it's about creating new spaces ourselves and working collectively to not always focus our attention on what the mainstream predominantly white media spaces are doing. So I think sometimes we see a lot of corporate discussions to do with equality, diversity and inclusion when there's a focus on trying to get Black people to be included in environments that we know will be hostile to them. So I think as Black workers and as Black people who focus on the media and creativity, it's thinking about how can we create new spaces ourselves, and how can we ensure that we don't spend what little energy we do have left when we're dealing with global crises and just trying to become included in a space that was never created by or for us, and a space within which we may never be able to thrive in the way that we could and should.
Black Lives Matter has been a tsunami protest movement throughout the world. And not many people comment on the fact that it was founded by 3 Black women. What's the significance of that?
I think the significance is there are so many incredible activist movements and incredible forms of collective organizing whereby Black women being at the center of things is erased. So I think when there are moments when the way that a movement took shape is sort of re-narrativized to essentially exclude Black women from that history and that archiving, I think that's just a reflection of again, the intersecting nature of oppression and why it's important for us as part of Black liberationist struggles to always be attentive in terms of recognising how those connect to gender, to class, and to so many other issues too.
Right. So we've seen an almost a rainbow of individuals, although it's been militant, radical Black youth at the heart of these global demonstrations. There have been lesbian and gay, LGBTQ supporters in significant numbers, women, white people, and of course we welcome white allyship, don't we, where it comes from a genuine place. Do you rejoice in that?
I think I rejoice in moments where I see collective struggles working in a way that foregrounds the perspectives of the people who are impacted by the struggle we are working to address. So I welcome moments where people are working across difference and are coming together in ways that involve moments of support and connection that aren't necessarily based on shared identities. But I think what I always like to see as part of that sort of work is still the people who are impacted by the form of oppression that we're working to challenge being up stuff, setting the terms of how that space works and ensuring that their health, safety and well-being is always prioritised.
Great. So you agree with the Black Members Council, the Black self-organisation, Black self-determination, Black leadership of the anti-racist struggle. They're principles we can't compromise on. For instance, BAME, the name, don't know where it came from, probably Whitehall, some white middle-class men in the Office of Population and Census. What do you think of that term?
So it's a term that I personally don't feel is useful. I think different people have different opinions on all of these terms and how they work. I think for me, again, there are definitely moments where it's useful to recognize commonalities between people with different backgrounds, and sometimes broader terms can help us to understand that and to communicate that. But I think what I worry about sometimes is when the conversations don't involve the specific acknowledgement of the differences that exist too. So for me, there are other terms that I will always go towards before that. And I think what's helpful for us as we work in the future is having these conversations about different collective experiences, but also always being specific and recognizing the different ways that people self-define.
You mentioned colorism, which I don't think is talked about enough. We're both light-skinned. How important do you think it is that people like us speak out against it?
I think it's very important. I think colorism is often sidelined and is often pushed to the side as part of conversations to do with racism and anti-Blackness specifically. I think it's very important that light-skinned people speak about it, but also not in a way that sort of centers their own perspectives or platforms themselves in some sort of way. So I do think as part of any racial justice work and as part of any Black activist work, if there isn't an intention to address colorism as part of that work, then there's a real question around how effective that work can be and whether or not there's a real understanding of the nuanced issues that Black people face and how Black people with different shades and different tones in terms of their skin color, some are more likely to face incredibly awful forms of oppression that others just aren't.
Yeah, I mean, you used to see it in the Benetton ads, and now it's right across the piece that it's light skin, particularly children, sometimes in mixed, families that are pushed to the fore as the acceptable face of the Black race. And that can't do great things for dark-skinned sisters and brothers thinking, well, why aren't I in the ad? Why aren't I in the TV program? And popular culture plays such an important role, doesn't it, in either enforcing or reinforcing how people feel about themselves, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think these conversations to do with colorism can also connect to conversations to do with the ways we see interracial relationships are incredibly visible in comparison to relationships between two Black people. So I think there are many examples, as you've said, of the focus being upon light-skinned Black people or Black people who are still in proximity to whiteness and lightness, whether that's featuring with a white partner in a marketing campaign so that the brand can feel as though they're ticking an EDI box, but they're still very much putting a white face or a light face at the forefront of stuff.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure you won't mind if our viewers contact you with any questions or comments.
No, I'd welcome anybody to get in touch. And I just want to say once more, thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this today. And I really appreciate all the work that everybody's doing.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Francesca Sobande.
Thank you.